Hi, I'm the Rifter, and this is another photography tutorial. Today we're going to talk about the principle that cameras work off of, which is called reciprocity. And then we're also going to talk about what an f-stop is. You may have heard that term thrown around. Also, a little fun fact I was telling you about reflectors in the last episode. Does not have to be anything fancy, but it can be the difference between this and this. See those real harsh shadows under my eyes? Doesn't even have to be anything expensive. There's with the reflector, there's without. And this is just a piece of poster board from Walmart. And I know the reflection off my big bald head doesn't help any either. But let's get started. I'm trying something a little different, hopefully somewhere in this area, maybe right here, or if you're lucky, over my face, I'll have some graphics and text. But the first thing, reciprocity. Big word. I know you guys can handle this. Reciprocity. It's basically, it means mutual dependency. So what you do to one thing, you have to do something to at least one of the other things in order to make it work. So another way to look at reciprocity is this for that, almost like quid pro quo. Basically, it's like, hey, you do this for me, I'll do that for you. So cameras work off of a combination of ISO, which I'll get back to that, your shutter speed, and then your aperture. ISO is derived from, this is the dumbest acronym I've ever heard, because it's ISO. It stands for the International Organization for Standardization. You would think it would be iOS, but it's not. It's stupid. So basically ISO is your film speed, and that it's just going to make it easier for you to understand. So if you've ever heard somebody saying, oh, this is a film speed of 100 or 200, that's what they're referring to as the ISO. This is how fast your sensor reacts to light. The higher your ISO, the faster your sensor is going to react to light. So that means you can use faster shutter speeds and you can use wider apertures while you're shooting with a high ISO. And that's good, because the less time your shutter's open, the more crisp and clear your pictures are going to be. Because the more that shutter's open, the more you can jiggle your camera around by, Michael J. Fox it, and, you screwed up your whole shot if you have a low ISO. Now, as your ISO increases, like, you've got 100, well, there's a lot of different ISO speeds. There's a ton of them, actually. Let's start with a film I used to shoot back in the day. It was called Fuji Velvia. It had an ISO of 50. Like 50, 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200, and so on. As you go up in ISO, it makes your sensor a lot more reactive, and the same with film. But you'll start seeing these little pixelated hot spots almost, and it's just film grain. Like, if you've ever seen a black and white photo and it looks real seedy and grainy, that's exactly what that is. They're using a high ISO, and that's how they get that look. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. High ISOs, you may want that look. Photography is completely subjective. One person may hate the photo you took, another may like it. There's technically no wrong way to take a photo. This series is designed to help you know more about photography. So eventually I'll start giving you some tips on how to improve your technique, but you need to learn the basics first in order to understand what you're doing, and if you're trying to accomplish something, then how to accomplish that. So the next is your shutter. I've seen cameras do this in third increments and half increments. I'm going to do half because that's just easier. So your shutter is split into fractions of a second. The fractions of a second, you have half, quarter, eighth, 1/16, and then you can go all the way down to 1/8,000th of a second or 12,000th. It just depends on what your camera does. Again, you will have to check your owner's manual to know exactly what yours will shoot at, but that is just extra research you'll have to do because every single camera has a different maximum shutter speed. Once you get down to 1 second, most cameras will go 1, 2, 4, 8, 10, and so on until it gets to 30. And then you're going to have a setting that says B. And B stands for bulb. I never tried to figure out why they decided to go with bulb, but bulb just means that the longer you hold your shutter button down, the longer that shutter will remain open. And B is typically used for time-lapse shots, or one where you leave the shutter open for several hours or 20 minutes. Astrophotography is another popular realm of photography, and bulb is used quite often. Usually you'll have a remote shutter, and a remote shutter is just a cord you attach to your camera, and it has a button on it. And you can lock that button down, set it down, and walk away while your camera's on a tripod, so no one's going to disturb it. Your shutter will control how much light is hitting your sensor. The shutter controls your ambient exposure to light. So when you set a fast shutter speed, you're cutting ambient light. And I'm not really going to talk about flashes yet, but when you have a flash, the shutter will not cut your flash exposure. It just won't do it. Then you got things like flash sync and all that other stuff, but I will cover that later in another video. That's a little far down the line. We need to get the basics down first. Now your aperture, this is that thing I was talking about in the other video, the little opening in there. The wider it goes, the slimmer your field of focus is going to be. The smaller it goes, it is going to widen your depth of field. So that's from the end of your camera lens to whatever you're taking a photo of, to infinity if you want. But I'm just doing it like this so you can see it's actually going from you and away. Now, aperture will actually cut your flash. So if you don't want to dial back your flash exposure, then you would use your aperture to cut light. So the next thing we should talk about is called a stop. You've probably heard somebody talk about an f-stop. An f-stop, that is that f/number. A stop in photography is halving or doubling the amount of light. This scene you're seeing right here with my awesome face in it is exposed properly for my camera that I'm using to take this video. Now, if I were to, let's say I'm shooting at 200 ISO right now, and don't worry about the other settings, but 200 ISO. If I were to increase the ISO to 400, I would look a lot brighter. By about half, but that is increasing by one f-stop, or one stop. Now, if you took the shutter speed from 60 to 125, that would be cutting it by one stop because you're removing half the light that's hitting your sensor. And I know that it's kind of iffy, you might not get it right now, but the more you go out and actually take photos, which that's what I recommend you do, go out and take photos. Experience is the best teacher in photography. And the best part about digital photography is you have your EXI, I think it's called EXIF information, but you right click your file, go to properties, and then you can usually go to details, and it will give you every single setting that photo was taken at. So you know what your shutter speed, your aperture, your ISO, and a ton of other things. If you have GPS on your camera, it'll tell you where you took it. So the I want to say it's EXIF, so don't completely quote me on that. But all that extra data, metadata, I think that's what I'm talking about. All that is very helpful, especially when you're learning. Okay, so now comes the kind of difficult part without any kind of visual aid. So I'm going to attempt to do this in editing, but we'll see how that turns out. I've no doubt that you've seen your exposure meter inside your camera. Like some of you probably have a DSLR and don't really know how to use it, but you see that -2 to +2. Cameras don't see in color. Cameras see in tonal scales. So they see from texture. I learned photography from a book, and it was called John Shaw's Landscape Photography is what I learned out of, and his scale made the most sense to me. So I'm kind of going to steal his because it's real easy to figure out. You've no doubt seen inside your camera the -2 to +2. If you've seen that, then you're already a step ahead of the curve. You'll know exactly what I'm talking about. -2, we're not going to talk about -2. We're going to talk about -2.5. So when your little cursor goes past -2, you're actually at like -2.5 or -2 1/3 if you have third stop increments. But once you go down below -2, that should be textureless black. So if you are pointing at something and it's flashing below -2, photo is going to turn out really dark unless you've already metered it correctly. Which that's something I need to talk about before I talk about this scale. Your light meter. That little scale that we're talking about actually coincides with that light meter. Now, I'm talking about shooting on manual exposure. Manual exposure is the easiest thing to grasp, especially if you are going to shoot landscape photography. You can go out and do program mode, but you're probably not going to get the results you want. You can go out and do aperture priority, and that will probably yield far better results. But you're going to have a button on your camera, and again, you will have to look at your manufacturer's instructions, but it is going to be called an exposure lock or an auto exposure lock. My advice to you is to find out how to put your camera on spot metering. And a lot of camera manufacturers, they have a circle right in the center when you look through your viewfinder. And inside that circle is what you use for spot metering. So if you go outside and look at something which you think is a medium tone, which it's all subjective, but there are ways of getting a properly exposed photo. Go on Amazon, get something called a gray card. What I do is I set that gray card down near what I want to take a photo of. Just make sure the same light is hitting that gray card as what's hitting your subject. So if there's a lot of contrast in your scene, like dark spots versus light spots, you will put that card in whichever one you want to show up. So if the stuff in light is what you want to show up, set that in the light instead of in the shaded area, and then take a reading of that card and hit exposure lock. That's going to lock all of those settings in. That way you can walk around, recompose your shot, and take a photo. That gray card that I was talking about is rated for medium, a medium tone. It should be 0 in whatever light you're putting it in. The human eye can see a lot higher dynamic range than your camera can. A lot of cameras now max can do about 7 stops in both directions. The human eye can see a lot more. That's why real life looks a lot more vivid, but photography looks interesting because it's what the photographer wants you to see. It's their subject matter. -2.5 is textureless dark. 0 should be medium, and then plus 2.5 is textureless white. All that little scale and all those little notches, if you see something that you consider a light tone, you will want to meter it and then adjust your shutter speed to +1. That would be considered light. Or you can adjust your aperture until it says +1. Or you can adjust your ISO until it says +1. Again, that's what reciprocity is. All of these things work together. If you let's say you meter a scene and you're not quite getting the speed you want on your shutter, you can open your aperture up to make it bigger, which is going to let more light in, but then you just have to adjust your shutter speed to knock the light back and you'll still get your proper exposure. And it doesn't make sense right now, but again, I said, go out and take photos. The best teacher. Usually on your camera, when you're adjusting these things, it'll just be clicks. So let's say you want to open up one stop. If you have half stop increments, you're going to click twice for the aperture and the ISO, or the aperture and the shutter speed. You have to, if you're doing one, you have to do the other. You don't have to do all three. Kind of confusing at first, but I will try to put some graphics up on the screen to make it a little bit easier. Hopefully this episode isn't a complete dumpster fire by the time I'm done with it and I haven't completely screwed you guys up. But I kind of want to get this information out there because in the next few videos I will actually be going out and taking some photos and teaching. In the aperture, you're probably going to have a little bit more trouble with that because it's not inherently obvious what a double and a half is, unless you do that stupid formula that I told you, your focal length divided by 22, then you'll get the amount of square millimeters in that little hole. That's the number they're actually going off of, but they've simplified it and just made, again, the ISO, International Organization for Standardization. They've set a standard at what that aperture should be, and they also did the same thing with film speed. It just makes things easier across all these different camera manufacturers. That way, if you go from one brand to the other, it's a lot easier to get accustomed to it. So we've talked about ISO, shutter, and aperture. That is pretty much all I really wanted to cover in this video. I will try to put some graphics up during this to make it a little bit easier. Again, if you have any questions, I know there's not a lot of people that have been watching this yet, but please leave them in the comments down below. If you like, share, and subscribe, I really appreciate it. But again, any questions, please leave them in the comments down below. Or if you take any photos, please, no joke photos. Don't take a picture of your balls. No one wants to see it. But link to them in the comments and I will take a look at them and tell me what you're trying to do, and then I'll suggest something and see if that works for you. But this is kind of how you learn, and this is like a free education for you, so you're welcome, I think. Anyway, I'm the Rifter. Thank you for watching.